over the kingdom and all competing for the king's attention, and she lived with the palace eunuchs, who were charged with keeping people out of the harem, but also keeping the women in. The last half of verse 14 of chapter 2 says a lot about harem life with just a few brief words. The girl who is now a concubine will never again go to the king unless he calls for her by name. We learn that the harem was divided into two sections, one filled with virgin girls who had yet to meet and spend the night with the king, and the other section filled with the king's concubines, who may or may not have found favor with him. This highlights the cruelness of polygamy. Each girl in the harem was merely a number. If the king had a large number of concubines, and most of them did, he only called for his favorites. The rest were forgotten. Orphaned, kidnapped, isolated. This was Esther's story. And this doesn't even take into account that her people had been living in captivity and subjugated her whole life, and now they were being threatened with genocide. This was not a fairy tale. Esther's life was filled with trauma after trauma, all taking place within the glittering walls of a palace. So why do we often portray it as a beauty pageant or a fairy tale? I believe in large part this is due to Esther's character. If you were able to complete the homework this week, you know that Esther was far from perfect. She was a regular person, just like you and me. But she rose to a significant challenge, responding rather than reacting to very hard circumstances. Esther did not save her people through her outward beauty. It was her inner beauty that drew people in and ultimately led to the story's happy ending. So let's delve into some of those character traits. First, Esther had a positive attitude no matter the circumstances. In several verses of chapter 2, we learn that Esther pleased those around her and won their favor, including the eunuch Haggai, the king, and in verses 15 through 16, it states that she won the favor of everyone. Everyone, which in this case means even the girls she was competing against. I don't watch the show. However, I also don't live under a rock. And even I have seen clips of the television show, The Bachelor. Usually, we don't see the best of human behavior when we have dozens of women all competing for the attention of one man. Somehow, Esther managed to rise above the fray and exude goodness. I must confess, I have failed at this too many times to count. While I've thankfully never been in a harem, I have often found myself in situations where I felt the need to jockey for position, even when it's not a competition at all. Growing up, I had to compete for favored status, and rarely did I achieve it. This uncertainty produced so much anxiety, which led to reactionary behaviors such as impatience, anger, and a competitive spirit. Frankly, I don't see myself in Esther in this way, but I do see who I hope to become. Now, I can only guess as to how Esther won the favor of everyone, but I feel like I can safely assume she exemplified positive character traits, such as those found in the Proverbs 31 woman. Esther was likely hardworking and generous. She more than likely lived out the love found in 1 Corinthians 13, showing patience, kindness, goodness, and gentleness to all she encountered. And I believe that because those are the types of women that I like to hang around. In a harem, with dozens of women competing for the attention of one man, it would be easy to slip into envy, boasting, pride, slander. She must have avoided all of those traps, or she would not have found favor with everyone. The Bible tells us repeatedly how important it is to maintain a positive attitude despite difficult circumstances. Philippians 2:14 through 15 says, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky." Stars in the sky. Did you know that the name Esther means star? We are called to be a bright light in the darkness, exuding goodness and kindness, no matter how difficult our life is. We are called to be stars in the sky. Second, Esther was content with what she was given, never asking more for herself. In chapter 2, verse 13, we learn that Esther could have asked for any material thing to be taken with her from the harem to the king's palace, but she asked only for the things that Haggai suggested she bring with her. Living in a palace, surrounded by women competing with one another, all trying to establish a pecking order, Esther made a conscious decision to be content and grateful with little. She did not allow satins and jewelry to turn her head, instead remaining focused on God and his will for her life. Not only was she not seduced by riches, she also didn't allow power and prestige to turn her head. In chapter 2, verse 22, when Esther reported the plot to kill the king, she gave full credit to Mordecai instead of stealing the credit all for herself. She was content to be simply the messenger rather than the one who saved the day. And she did this because of her strong character, not understanding that years later, this would save not only Mordecai, but the entire Jewish race. In this same way, it may take years for us to discover the impact of the credit and the praise that we give to others, if we learn of it at all. Webster's dictionary defines contentment as being satisfied with what one is or has, not wanting more or anything different. Contentment is not about changing one's circumstances, but about changing one's perspective. Most often, people think of money and possessions when considering a lack of contentment, but it can also be wishing you had a friend's popularity, or that your husband helped around the house as much as your neighbor's husband does, or feeling discontent with how our bodies look, or because our days look different than what we've hoped for. It can be about how you're handling month 24 of this never-ending pandemic. I'll be honest, it's been a struggle for me these past 3 months. Between the four of us, my family has 7 pre-existing conditions, several of which don't mix well with COVID. We did okay during the early days of the shutdown, and we formed a small social bubble to help us get through last year. But this year, it's been more difficult for me. We started taking steps back into normal this fall, and then Omicron hit full force. Normalcy is slowly returning, but there is still so much affected. For example, our family really wanted to travel to San Francisco over spring break this spring, but there are still so many challenges. For our family, hotel restaurants are not open yet, and we have food allergies, so we can't go. There is a vast chasm between what I want life to be like and the reality of what is right now. But I remind myself that contentment is a choice, albeit a hard choice at times, that requires a lot of self-discipline, avoiding comparisons. Not just comparisons with others, but comparisons with what used to be or what we want. This is vital as I'm learning through this season, because when we are comparing, we cannot connect. Comparisons open the door to resentment. We cannot connect with others when we're busy resenting them. Plus, comparisons don't just affect our connection with others, but also with God. They put our focus on the wrong place. We waste precious energy focusing on other people's lives rather than focusing on God. Philippians 4:11 through 13 tells us to be content whatever the circumstances. Paul states, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength." I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. This oft-quoted verse is not talking about accomplishing one's goals or fulfilling dreams. It's about working towards contentment. That is made much easier when we rely on Jesus, who gives us the strength to focus on the blessings that he has given us and to celebrate the blessings that he has given to others. Third, Esther was prudent, acting with or showing care and thought for the future. A prudent woman knows that life will hand her challenges, and she wants to be prepared for any eventuality. Esther was prudent enough to look for strong mentors, most notably her cousin Mordecai and the king's eunuch Haggai. She listened to them at pivotal moments of her life story, trusting their wisdom and humbly accepting their advice. Since you never know what's going to happen around the corner, it's good to surround yourself with a strong support system and wise counsel. Esther knew this. She even submitted to Mordecai's authority after she became queen. It's very easy to become prideful after experiencing success, but Esther's new royal position did not change her character. Her conversation with Mordecai in chapter 4 is a pivotal moment. The evil Haman plotted to destroy the Jewish nation and convinced the king to issue an edict that would ultimately annihilate the Jews. It would have been very easy for Esther to ignore her past and focus on her future. No one but Mordecai knew that Esther was Jewish. She could have silently stood by, safe from the purge. And approaching the king was fraught with danger. By appearing at the court uninvited, Esther would place herself under the king's whim. Would he be in a good mood? Would he be ticked off at a second unsubmissive queen? The fear that Esther displayed showed she believed her life was at risk. But Mordecai correctly and famously told her in Esther 4:14, "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" Esther listened and continued to show prudence by carefully planning rather than rushing ahead. First, she fasted for 3 days, asking that other Jews do the same. Although the scripture does not mention prayer, most often prayer does accompany fasting, so more than likely Esther used this time to ask for God's guidance. She thought carefully and prayerfully about how to proceed, and guide her God did. In chapter 5, when the king held out his scepter, telling Esther she could have anything she wanted, she did not take that opportunity to blurt out her request. Presumably, God told her not to because he still had more work to do. It's been said that the quickest way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and Esther seemed to understand that. Her banquets put the king in a good and amicable mood. At the same time, it enabled Esther to think carefully about what God wanted her to say and how he wanted her to say it. It also gave time for God to work, creating a sleepless night for the king and a reminder of how Mordecai had once saved him from assassination. No one can accuse Esther of being rash. She acted deliberately, prudently. Of course she was afraid. Fear is a natural response to such dangerous circumstances, but it is how a person responds to fear that is the most important. Psalm 56:3 states, "When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you." With Mordecai's encouragement, Esther put her faith in God. This is the area where I most identify with Esther. While I am often quick to put my foot in my mouth, I am not one for making quick decisions. My friends will laughingly tell you that I am more inclined to say no and to keep to the status quo than to say yes to pretty much anything. I am always thinking about the future. How will saying yes to this impact my life next week? What about next month? What about next year? I pray about most decisions, and I also heavily rely on advice from experts and mentors. Life can be hard, and I need all the help I can get. I very much value the mentors in my life, especially my friend Kate, who never offers advice. Instead, like Mordecai, she knows how to ask questions that lead me closer to God and to self-discovery. Years ago, when my now 17-year-old was a toddler, my husband and I had a conversation with two of his cousins, both of whom were internationally adopted from Asia, just as our daughters are. I remember one of his cousins, Sarah, gently asking Rick and me a question that was pretty hard to hear. Sarah didn't preach at us. She didn't lecture. She simply asked a question and gave space for God to work in our hearts over time. That question drastically changed our parenting and ultimately how we see the world and those around us. Cousin Sarah's comment, so gently asked, was nonetheless hard-hitting and tough to hear. So too was Mordecai's comment to Esther. Who knows, perhaps you became queen for just such a time as this. Mordecai's challenge to Esther leads to my last point. We have a choice to be a part of God's plan or not. God's agenda is unstoppable, but our involvement is optional. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, not even once. Most scholars believe this omission was intentional in order to highlight how often God works behind the scenes. There was no direct intervention of God recorded, nor were any overt miracles listed. And yet we see God's hand clearly in the unfolding of history. In the book of Esther, we see a string of coincidences that saved the Jewish nation. First, Esther is selected from among many to become queen. Second, Mordecai just happens to overhear a plot to assassinate the king. Third, the king benevolently pardons Esther when she comes uninvited to the hall. Fourth, God troubles the king with insomnia, leading him to ask his attendant to read aloud, and it just so happens that the attendant chooses to read about Mordecai exposing the assassination plot. These were not coincidences. These were God incidences. Despite God's orchestration of events behind the scenes, the main players still had choices, most especially Esther. She had a choice to sit on the sidelines or to join God in his good work. We can do the same in our own lives. God's providence is at work all around us, even when life gets difficult, even when we struggle to feel his presence. I wonder if God wants us to search the book of Esther for his presence so that we can learn to search our own lives for his presence. And when we find him, we, like Esther, have the choice to turn a blind eye or to actively participate in his will. This is something I always strive to get better at, and I'm grateful that a few years ago, God provided me with some focus. Every year, each member of our family picks a new word for the year. I know many of y'all do this. It can be a very powerful exercise of self-reflection and spiritual growth. But in 2018, our family added a little something, stealing an idea from former Mackers military family Doug and Lori Tupper. Each year on New Year's Day, the Noonan family creates a poster with every family member writing down their word for the year, along with various scriptures and quotes to help clarify exactly what that word means. Rick and I always choose our words after a lot of prayer, and we encourage our girls to choose their words prayerfully as well. In 2019, God wanted me to grow better at finding joy in all circumstances. In 2020, the Lord wanted me to focus on actively engaging with others. And last year, God told me I needed to choose the word rise. I didn't know why. It seemed rather vague, rise, not as specific as my previous word choices. I mean, yes, 2020 had been a very difficult year, but at the time, January 1st was filled with hope and promise. We even laughingly ripped up our 2020 poster. We'd never done that before on New Year's Eve. I didn't know then, but the Lord did, that last year, 2021, was going to be one of the most difficult years of my life. That winter, my 17-year-old daughter was diagnosed with an eating disorder. And yes, I have Abby's full permission to share this story. Abby wasn't alone. Calls to the National Eating Disorder Hotline rose 150% during the pandemic. Our family was blessed that we caught it early when she was still at a healthy weight, but unfortunately, Abby's body had already shifted into a hypermetabolic state, and she dropped weight rapidly during the first month of treatment, despite our best efforts. All total, Abby lost over 40 pounds in 6 months, with her lowest weight being nearly identical to her 11-year-old sister. February, March, and April of this past year were some of the absolute hardest months of my life. Every day, I had to rise and try again. Ezra 10:4 became my verse. Rise up, this matter is in your hands. We will support you, so take courage and do it. We all worked hard, most especially Abby, and I am so very proud to say that just after Halloween, Abby's medical team declared her officially in recovery. Anorexia is something that will always be with her, but she's currently at a healthy weight for her, and more importantly, she has absolute food freedom. No fear of food, no calorie counting. She makes mostly healthy choices, but she feels no shame or guilt when indulging in a treat. It's been just over a year since our family started this journey, and already God has used it. A close friend reached out to us several months ago, asking for guidance with her own teen daughter's disordered eating. We were immediately able to recommend resources and to provide an empathetic ear and prayer support. And just last month, Abby shared with me that she's strongly considering majoring in nutrition so that she can become a registered dietitian, able to help others experiencing similar struggles. This year, God gave me the word purpose. I don't know why. Maybe I'll never know, but I will spend this year looking to fulfill God's purpose for my life. How would all of our lives be different if in each and every situation we looked for God's purpose and thought to ourselves, God will use this somehow to help others. God wants me here, right here, to accomplish his will and to learn and to grow. What will your word be for such a time as this? Thank you.